We've got a few more people coming online, so I'll do some acknowledgements and introductions. The first one is myself. I'm the coordinator of the Australian Seed Bank Partnership, and Brad Desmond, who you can see, wave along. Brad is here with me, and obviously Tom, who's going to be talking to us in a few minutes. To open, I just want to acknowledge and pay my deep respects to elders past and present of the Canberra region, where Brad and I are situated at the Australian National Botanic Gardens, and pay those respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. And I want to extend that respect to all traditional custodians of all the lands and seas of this very diverse continent that we're lucky enough to live on. And I'd also like to acknowledge the generosity of First Nations people in sharing their knowledge about plants and their country, which is helping to guide and enrich our work here at the partnership. And it is Reconciliation Week, so I think, we all feel really blessed to be taking those steps in working with First Nations people. Now, a few things about the partnership. We're a not-for-profit alliance, 15 different organisations. 10 of those are conservation seed banks at our botanic gardens. Now, the sort of activities we get involved in are seed collecting and banking. We do that to provide insurance for wild species, and also to provide the material to research those species. We have to know how to germinate them once we collect them, and we then develop protocols about how they can be raised. The other important aspect of our work, which is actually increasing in importance, is the research and science we're doing, particularly around genetic analyses that's going to inform, future survival of plants in the face of climate change, and particularly invasive species like myrtle rust. Final thing we do, which is a really important aspect, and Brad does our awesome social media, and you'll see at the top of my slide and Brad's slide, please follow us. There's a lot of good news stories on our site, and we now have a LinkedIn profile as well, so we share some of the research that's going on amongst our partners. So as part of that communication, we're holding these PlantChat webinars. We want to not only raise the profile of our partners' work, but bring in people like Tom that are what I think is providing sort of foundational work around how we expand the impact of what we do. Now, we all know that citizen science can play an important role in plant conservation. It helps us to map and understand where plants are, to monitor what's happening with them. And we should never underestimate the power of volunteers. If we just relied on our paid workforce and our academics to work on plants, we just wouldn't have the nature and scale of data sets that we have. There's a couple of quick examples I want to give you from Canberra. The Canberra Orchid Society's done a few surveys post the two big fires that Canberra's had in the last couple of decades, the 2003 fire and the 2020 fires. After the 2003 fires here, they found a couple of orchid species, new species to the region. After the 2020 fires, they went back and resurveyed and found new populations of existing species. They do that on the smell of an oily rag. They do it out of passion and goodwill. Sometimes they get fieldwork dollars. But the other key thing is that they're always working with the scientists in the work they do. Another beautiful but small example is from Black Mountain, which is the mountain behind where we're situated at the National Botanic Gardens. Citizen scientists and the ACT government's conservation scientists worked on mapping and understanding orchids post-fire, which is now feeding into future prescribed burning and management of the mountain. So I think they're just two lovely little examples from where we live. And Tom will obviously provide much more context in terms of what's happening across Australia. I will post this webinar. We'll actually post the link to the webinar, but we'll also post some of the stories. Tom's been doing some amazing research on all sorts of things, including why it's important to photograph plants. Tom is a PhD candidate at the University of New South Wales. It sounds like he's probably a rock star and a guru in this citizen science space. He's been a curator and a moderator across these platforms. He's published research across a wide range of different disciplines. And he's also received a Eureka Prize, I noticed, Tom. You were very modest in your bio. You didn't even reference that. But I think having Tom come and speak to us is the start of a process. There may be opportunities if people want to learn more about actually using iNaturalist to have a bit of a more of an interactive workshop, because Tom's up in Sydney. So we'll talk about some of that stuff at the end of the webinar. So now I'll hand over to you, Tom. Oh yes, Brad's just reminding me. Please place your questions in the Q&A in the chat, and we'll get to them after Tom's finished speaking. So welcome, Tom.
Thank you very much, Catherine and Brad. And I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okie dokie. So just before I get started proper, I wanted to make an important statement, and that is that every single person listening into this webinar right now is able to make meaningful contributions to our understanding of Australia's amazing flora. So it doesn't matter whether you've been studying plants for decades or whether you're just starting out on your nature journey and getting interested in plants literally today. Everyone has a different but nonetheless really important role to play. And one of the main reasons that that is even possible is with the emergence of citizen science over the last decade. Now, of course, there are lots of different platforms out there across all kinds of different taxa, and there are plenty of citizen science platforms you can get involved with if you are interested in plants. But the main one I'm going to talk about today is iNaturalist, which hopefully most, if not all of you, have either heard of or already use. So it operates off a pretty simple principle. You go out and you take photographs of any organism you possibly encounter. Now, of course, today's focus is plants, but one thing I do want to emphasize is that iNaturalist is taxon agnostic. So whether you're photographing plants, animals, fungi, slime molds, bacteria, viruses, you name it, it's all fair game. But we'll focus on plants here. So you go out and you photograph a plant that you have never seen before. So what do? Well, you come back home and you upload it to iNaturalist. Now you can do this via either a mobile phone app, or you can do it via the desktop version of iNaturalist. Once you've popped it up onto the platform, you have this incredible community of naturalists and experts from around the entire globe. So iNaturalist isn't just constrained to Australia, and they're able to identify your records for you. Now, if you have absolutely no idea what you photographed, that's totally fine, and these people can add IDs for you. But if you do know what you already saw and you're able to identify it yourself, that's also fine, and other users can confirm that identification. And then what I always think is particularly exciting, once your records are identified, they're then exported to these external data aggregators. So in the case of Australia specifically, we have the Atlas of Living Australia, which is our national biodiversity database, and it's actually the host of the iNaturalist Australia node. And then from a bigger global perspective, we have the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, which currently contains over 3 billion natural history records from around the world. And the reason that it's so important that your records do percolate into these external databases is that's where researchers, conservationists, land managers are able to look at all of the data in one place, not just from iNaturalist, but also from herbaria, from surveys, from all kinds of different data providers. And then they're able to use that data in their research and in their conservation. So what I mentioned straight away at the start of my talk, every single data point that you contribute and put up does genuinely make an important difference to our understanding of plants across the country. Now, I mentioned very briefly just then, there are a lot of experts on iNaturalist, and this is one of the key elements that really makes the platform stand out, and something that has really evolved in the last few years in particular, that from an Australian perspective, but also from a global perspective, there are now hundreds, thousands of amazing experts, taxonomists, botanists, ecologists from all around the globe that are constantly able to share their knowledge with all of the other naturalists that are using the platform. So as just two very, very brief examples, for anyone who is interested in the genus Herbaceae, which is one of Australia's most diverse plant genera, you may have encountered someone called Tim Hammer before. He's based in Adelaide. He is one of Australia's top Herbaceae experts. He has described many, many Herbaceae species. And as you can see here, he's highly active on iNaturalist. So of the almost 35,000 Herbaceae records that have been uploaded to iNaturalist so far, he has added identifications to 19,000 of them. Similar vein, we have Stylidium, an amazing genus of plant, which again is in the top 10 most diverse plant genera in Australia. We've got just over 21,000 records on iNaturalist, and Juliet Wedge, who is currently the Australian authority on Stylidium. She's based in Perth. She has added identifications to 4,000 of those records. So you know that when you are adding your records of plants to iNaturalist, you are getting the best of the best adding identifications to those records. To give you a little sense of the numbers, because this is really one of the astonishing things about iNaturalist, if we zoom out to a global perspective and we look at everything, not just plants, we have almost 246 million records that have been added to the platform. And that's since 2008 when it first launched. And if we filter that just down to plants, we almost have 100 million records of plants. So these are incredible numbers. And if we look at Australia specifically, we have about 11 million records. So Australia certainly punches above our weight when it comes to iNaturalist. We are consistently in the top 2 or top 3 countries in the world for almost every single metric. And we are certainly number 1 in the world for pretty much every single metric when it comes to the Southern Hemisphere. It's really only the United States that has bigger metrics than us. And if we look at plants specifically, using the Flora of Australia project that's been set up, we're looking at about 3.5 million records of plants that have been uploaded across the country onto iNaturalist. So really, really amazing contributions from citizen scientists. And if we just very, very briefly look at some individual statistics, you can see here on the far right, the top species, no real surprises. Most of the most observed species are things that occur right around southeastern Australia, are quite common in the landscape. And some of the numbers from individual contributors are quite astonishing. So any of you who live up around southeast Queensland, you may have heard, well, if you do use iNaturalist, you almost certainly would have heard of Greg Tasney before. He has over 91,000 records of plants that he has personally uploaded just himself. And Rainer, who's down in Melbourne, similarly over 100,000 records of plants, which is really, really mind-blowing numbers. Now, admittedly, this figure is a little bit out of date. So this is a heat map that I created 4 years ago now for a paper that I wrote back in 2021. I do apologize for not regenerating it, but it took a significant amount of time to make it. But the broad scale patterns here absolutely still hold true 4 years later. And that is the spatial distribution of plant records and records really of anything on iNaturalist are obviously quite biased towards major cities and population centers. So you can see here big red patches. So the red is more records, and the cooler colors, the blues and purples, are fewer records. So you can see here you go to pretty much every capital city and then other smaller population centers like, say, Coffs Harbour or Cairns, and that's where all the records are. And so the point of me showing you this map is that there is huge amounts of opportunity here to fill in data gaps. So even if you think, well, what could I possibly contribute? I'm never going to see something rare or unusual. There are plenty of places you can go out where there are literally no plant records at all, not just on iNaturalist, but also herbarium vouchers as well. So there's plenty of really valuable gap filling you can do just by going out to some remote area where botanists or citizen scientists haven't gone before and photographing every plant you see in the landscape. So pretty much what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through these 4 or 5 major ways that you can contribute to iNaturalist, because that's really the key. A lot of people tend to have this mindset that, okay, I live in a city, there aren't many remote areas or amazing rainforests or strange vegetation communities around me. I'm mostly seeing common plant species on my walks. What can I actually contribute in a meaningful way to conservation and research? Well, the simple answer is that, as I've already alluded to, every single record of a plant, whether it's the most common plant in the landscape, or whether it's the first ever record of a particular species, they all have value in their own different way, right? And I think a way to think about it is like this. Let's say you go out and you're doing a walk in a national park and you see something like Banksia integrifolia, coastal Banksia, really, really common plant species all along the entirety of southeastern Australia. There are thousands and thousands of records of it, both photographic records and vouchers as well. But the thing is, if everyone just went along, saw a Banksia integrifolia and said, That's pretty common. Someone else will take a photo of it, or there's plenty of records that exist already, and you don't take a photo. And if everyone says that, then we won't have any records of that species at all, right? And unless everyone is photographing and recording these common species, then they won't appear as common in the databases. So when you go out there, you find plants, doesn't matter whether you think that they're important records or not, always photograph them and upload them, because they do genuinely make a difference. So this is just one example here. So this is a little plant, an Asteraceae, that I photographed when I was in Royal National Park a couple of years ago. Now, this was something that I didn't really recognize at the time, and I didn't have any conception that this would be a significant record. It was just an interesting little daisy, native daisy, that I thought looked pretty cool. It was a species that I didn't really recognize as having seen before. So I took some photos and I uploaded them to iNaturalist. I was having trouble figuring out what it is. And so I tagged Jian Wang, who is a botanist at Brisbane Herbarium. And he came along and he identified it straight away for me as Lagonophora brachyglossa. And so this is actually a genus of Asteraceae that he recently revised with another botanist, Tony Bean, who was also very active on iNaturalist. And he went ahead and identified it for me. And so I thought, okay, that's great. I've got a new species for myself. Didn't think much more of it. Fast forward a few years down the track, and I'm in the middle of my PhD. And one of my PhD chapters was compiling a master all-time species list for plants for Royal National Park. So I was looking at every single plant species that has ever been recorded in Royal National Park over the past 200 plus years. And as it turns out, this was the first and only record of this species ever in Royal National Park. It has never been collected in Royal National Park. It has never been photographed previously in Royal National Park. And so without me just being curious, encountering this daisy that I didn't recognize and popping it up, there still would be no record of this species from that Royal National Park. And that's a really important management unit, right? Because if we don't know the species that occur in our national parks and reserves, then how can we ever conserve and protect them? So this is a figure from that paper that I actually published. So this is one of my PhD chapters, where we not only looked at all of the plant species recorded for Royal National Park, but we also compared that with Yosemite National Park in California in the United States. And it's a bit of a convoluted graph, but the important thing to look at is this blue slice over here, the one that says 63, because that's the slice that contains species that were exclusively contributed to the all-time Royal National Park list just by iNaturalist records. So 63, this includes more than 200 years of botanists collecting thousands and thousands of specimens. And then it also includes a master park list that was put together by David Keith, a very famous ecologist and botanist that some of you may have heard of. And even with all of those efforts, those thousands of records, there were still 63 species of plant that had previously never been formally recorded for Royal National Park. And it wasn't until someone put photographs of them onto iNaturalist that they were actually able to be added to that list. So again, you can be walking in a park that gets tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of visitors literally every single year. And in fact, I think in the last few years, Royal National Park has actually had several million people visit it on an annual basis. And you can still make amazing discoveries. So just imagine what you can do if you go a little bit more off the beaten track. Very, very similar vein, but in a bit more of a remote area, we had this interesting looking plant get uploaded to iNaturalist last year in March from up in the Northern Territory. And for anyone who's ever been around Darwin, there's a really nice location called Fog Dam, about, say, 50 minutes drive east of Darwin. It's a fantastic birding spot. And you can see from this guy's profile, Torbjorn, so he is from Melbourne, and he does not have any botanical qualifications. He's a geophysicist and geologist. But again, reiterating my point, nonetheless, very, very important contributions to make. So you can see about a year ago, he uploaded his record and he just identified it as a flowering plant because he had no idea what it was. Then very shortly after, we had Thilo Kruger, who's actually a carnivorous plant expert from Curtin University in Perth, come along, and he was able to identify it to family. So Apocynaceae, many of you would know that as the milkweed family. And then finally, a year later, we had Aidan Webb come along, who is currently the collections manager at the Darwin Herbarium. And he identified it as Heterostemma magnificum. Now, this is pretty significant because A, these were the first ever photographs of this species that have been published online, but this was only the 7th ever record of this species. So before this record got put up, only 6 specimens had ever been collected of this particular species, and none of them were from this location. So this was a brand new population. And once Aidan had seen these photographs, he actually went out and was able to re-find the plant at the exact same spot that the photographs were put up. And so he was then able to collect another specimen as well. Again, all because someone just saw an interesting plant that they saw. They took some photos, they were curious, they put it on iNaturalist, and the fact that it was now in this public forum that many, many experts are constantly using meant that the right expert came along and was able to identify it. But this doesn't just apply to our native species, of course. There's a really, really important and increasingly important role played by iNaturalist for invasive and introduced species. And one of the most powerful uses of citizen science is actually for biosecurity monitoring. This is just a really nice recent example where Lachlan Copeland, who actually is a professional botanist, but he is an expert in orchids. He lives up on the mid-north coast of New South Wales, and he photographed this unusual looking passion fruit species that he didn't recognize. Now, we do have native passion fruits in Australia, but we also have many, many introduced passion fruit species that are serious weeds that have originated from the Americas. And he didn't really recognize this species, but thought it might have been something called Passiflora biflora. But he wasn't too sure because this species has actually never been recorded as naturalized in Australia before. So I saw his record. Now, luckily on iNaturalist, there are a number of fantastic experts in the genus Passiflora from Europe and from the Americas. I tagged 2 of them. They confirmed this was indeed Passiflora biflora. This is now a new naturalized weed record for New South Wales and Australia. And I've now been in touch with my colleagues at New South Wales DPI and at the New South Wales Herbarium, and we're looking to try and control this before it gets out of hand. Again, all because someone saw an interesting plant that they didn't really recognize, put it on iNaturalist, and then the right people were able to see it. Now, it's not just about the occurrence records themselves, where you have a species at a time and place, but you can also extract from a lot of these records amazing amounts of secondary data. Now, one of these is, of course, species interactions, and one of those being things like fungi and diseases and pests. So some of you may have heard of or have even contributed to this project, Gumtree Guardians. Though this was set up by Alyssa Martino, who's a researcher at the New South Wales Herbarium and the Royal Botanic Gardens in Sydney. And she is looking at the spread of myrtle rust, which of course affects many species in Australia, mostly along the east coast in the family Myrtaceae. And indeed, there are a number of species, particularly in genera like Rhodamnia, which are actually now critically endangered and on the precipice of extinction due to the spread of myrtle rust. So here, legitimately, every single data point that you're putting up is making a really important difference for understanding which species get affected by myrtle rust, what times of year myrtle rust is most prevalent, which kind of habitats and weather conditions myrtle rust might be spreading a lot. And in fact, very recently, some of you may have seen this ABC article that came out last week, where myrtle rust was actually detected at the National Museum in Canberra, and that originated from a record that was put up on iNaturalist. So again, it's not just about the native things, but the non-native things, the pests, the fungi, all of these groups that maybe a lot of people don't necessarily think are important to record are also equally important to photograph and put records onto iNaturalist. Now, very similarly, and perhaps a bit more of a positive and a good news story, is iNaturalist is fantastic for looking at things like phenology data. So for every given individual record on iNaturalist, you can add these things called annotations, and they're basically a means of adding secondary data. Now, across different taxa, these annotations will differ. So for example, if I put up a photograph of a bird, the annotations that are available to add to it will be different to the annotations available for plants. But if I put up a photo of a plant, one of the main annotations I can add relates to phenology. So I can say, was this plant flowering? Was it budding? Did it have fruits or seeds? Or was there no evidence of fertile material? And when you go ahead and you add those annotations, they then contribute to creating these amazing phenology charts. And the reason I bring up this specifically is that, of course, Australian Seed Bank Partnership, this is an amazing tool if you are a licensed seed collector and you're going out there and you want to know the best time of year to collect seeds and to collect material for certain species. Well, guess what? You can go on iNaturalist, you can look at those species, and you can see when people have been observing individual plants of that species that are fruiting or flowering. So the example I always like to use in these kind of talks is the P genus Divisia. And the reason for that is that there is this fantastic naturalist, Isaiah Findley, who has gone ahead and for thousands and thousands, like more than 15,000 records of Divisia, he has single-handedly added phenology annotations to them on iNaturalist, all just in his spare time. And so now, for this, let's say this species as an example, Divisia ulicifolia, I can search that species on iNaturalist, and I can go to this amazing phenology chart. Now here, the orange is budding, the red is flowering, the blue is fruiting, and the green is no fertile material. So straight away here, this becomes a really useful tool. You can say, okay, I really would like to collect some seed for Divisia ulicifolia. What's the best time of year for me to go out? Well, I'm going to have a look and I can see that this blue line, which represents the fruit, it has this clear peak around October. So that maybe, probably, likely, that's the best time to go out to collect seed. But then you think, okay, I can't actually make it in October. I'm really busy all of that month. But September and November are pretty good as well. So there's good chances that I'll be able to get seed then. And then you may think to yourself, but there's definitely still fruit January, February, March, right? Maybe I can go out then, but remembering that for this particular genus Divisia, they often retain the old dehisced fruits on the stems. And so in those cases, these records probably represent old fruit that have already released their seeds. So even that's useful information, right? So you can think, okay, I really should focus my seed collecting efforts on this September, October, November period, basically spring. So you can do this for any species, and you can look at the charts and figure out exactly when these things are budding, flowering, and fruiting. Now, of course, very, very important as well is tracking our threatened species, spanning all the way from near threatened up to critically endangered. Now, there's an amazing ecologist from Southeast Queensland, Michael Turvo, who spent a huge amount of time setting up this series of projects, one each for all of the different threat categories in Queensland. And so you can go ahead and search up this project at any time, Threatened Plants of Queensland on iNaturalist, and you can look at records of all of these endangered, critically endangered, vulnerable plants. And you can see here there are almost 15,000 of them, and these have been contributed by over 1,700 different observers. We can look at a map of that. And so again, this is a really nice opportunity for people to do gap filling. There are a tremendous amount of records, unsurprisingly, around Brisbane and the Gold Coast and the Sunshine Coast. Quite a lot up around Cairns as well. But if we go a bit inland, you can see things are pretty sparse in central and western Queensland. So again, if you do find yourself out on a holiday, on a work trip, or for whatever reason, out in central or western arid Queensland, take photos of as many plants as you can, because you're really going to be adding value to this data set. Now, there's also really, really cool opportunities, and this is something that is increasingly emerging in this field in iNaturalist, to actually do direct threat assessments through the platform. So this is an example that comes from South Africa, where they have a project called Red List South Africa. And through this project, the South African botanists are actually directly compiling data for their threatened species red listing. So what they do is you go out, you're a botanist, you have photographed and found some kind of threatened plant, you get back home, you upload that record to iNaturalist, and then you add it to this project. So just as a very brief aside, projects are basically, because I've mentioned them a few times, projects are basically a data collection structure within iNaturalist. So you have all of iNaturalist, which contains all records that people upload to the site. And then within it, you have these smaller kind of platforms within a platform, which are designed to accumulate and collate records with some kind of unifying theme. So in some cases, that theme might be just a location, or it might be a taxon. So you might have, for example, Acacia of New South Wales as a project. But in many cases, you also have far more extensive themes that tie things together. So in this case, it is specifically threatened plant species in South Africa that are being assessed for IUCN red listing. So in this case, when you add your individual record to this project, you will be prompted and asked to fill out some extra observation fields. Now, observation fields are very similar to annotations that we mentioned, like flowering and fruiting and budding, but the annotations are always standardized across all taxa, whereas observation fields are completely customizable. And so the botanists who set up this project, they created these specific observation fields, and you can fill out this extra information. So you've seen your plant, you've uploaded it to iNaturalist, you've added it to the project, and now you can fill out this really useful secondary data about things like what are the threats for this plant at this location, what was the population size, what's the habitat, how long has it been since fire, what's the altitude. And then conservationists and land managers are actively downloading this data from iNaturalist, and they can then see a massive spreadsheet with every single record and all of these extra data fields appended, and that then is able to inform all of their conservation assessments. So again, you go out and you take a photograph of a plant, it may actively be contributing to these actual on-the-ground conservation methods, which I always find particularly gratifying when I know that my records are being used in this kind of really pragmatic way. Again, a nice little one-off example to demonstrate the power of this. Last year in December, I did a week holiday in Kakadu with my sister. And of course, a holiday for me means spending 12 hours a day taking photographs of as many plants as I can possibly find. And we were at this particular wetland, a bit west of Kakadu. Wasn't having a great time. It was a pretty ordinary wetland, in my opinion. It was probably because I was a bit spoilt in the previous days with some amazing landscapes in Kakadu itself. But this wetland was a bit degraded. There were a lot of weed species around. I wasn't really seeing many interesting native things that I hadn't seen before. So I was a bit down in the dumps at that particular walk. And then after a while, I saw this interesting looking little plant. I pretty much only saw this small patch of 3 or 4 individuals. It was definitely something I hadn't seen on the trip yet. I didn't really recognize it. So I thought it was probably some kind of milkweed, but I wasn't sure. Took some photos, put them up on iNaturalist. I put in my ID of family Apocynaceae. And again, Aidan Webb, who's a recurring character now, reminder, he is the collections manager from the Darwin Herbarium. He came along, and it turns out this was actually a really significant record. And so if we pop over to the next slide, so this is Vincetoxicum lebianum. These are the notes, and I promise this is one of very few slides with a lot of text. These are the notes directly from the NT flora. So it's apparently endemic to Darwin. It's poorly surveyed and possibly threatened, but there is a great paucity of data. And the problem is it has a very short flowering period. The plants completely die back to only underground material during the dry season, which is when most people tend to be in the top end, and it's very difficult to survey. And keeping in mind that I recorded this plant from Kakadu, so this was a record hundreds of kilometers east of its known distribution. And so once again, Aidan, thanks to my record, he was able to go out and was able to make collections, and he now has a specimen from this new population. And all of this wasn't because I was doing a formal survey in my role as a botanist. I was literally just on holidays and just saw an interesting looking plant that I didn't recognize, and it turned out to be a highly significant record. So every single person listening into this webinar right now can achieve something like this on any given day. And so that's really important to remember, that until your records actually go up into the platform, you will never know the potential significance that they may hold. So if you kind of take photos and they collect digital dust on a hard drive, or you don't take the photographs in the first place, well, you'll never know at what amazing things that you may have stumbled upon. But it's actually just having a platform like iNaturalist that now offers the opportunity to have your records in a public forum that any person from anywhere in the world can look at any time is an immensely powerful tool. Now, one of the most important things, in my opinion, is having images of plants, right? So yes, absolutely, physical vouchers of plants are king. They are the gold standard. of biodiversity data. If you have herbarium specimens, you can go back to them at any time. You can put them under a microscope. You can extract DNA. There's all kinds of amazing analyses. But photographs are this incredible complementary tool that also add huge amounts of value that specimens don't necessarily always have. So, for example, you come across a 60-meter tall eucalypt. Now, of course, you can collect a herbarium specimen from that eucalypt, but it's not going to represent that whole tree, right? Whereas you can take a photograph of a 60-meter tall eucalypt. Same thing applies for cacti and euphorbiaceae and groups that have stinging hairs or spines or caustic sap. Photographs are often able to capture those things very well. Many groups as well have features that rapidly degrade or are lost in herbarium specimens. So a classic example of that is flower color. For anyone who has ever pressed plants, you would of course know that pretty soon after you've pressed a plant, it will often lose color. And so photographs are this fantastic complementary tool to physical specimens that are held in herbaria. And one of my big goals, both for myself and driving other people from all around Australia, is to try and get every single plant in Australia photographed and have records on iNaturalist. So a few years ago, for one of the first chapters of my PhD, I looked at every single native plant species in Australia and figured out which of them did and did not have photographs of live plants anywhere online. And what we found was that of the just over 21,000 native Australian plant species that had been described up until 2018, over 3,700 did not have publicly accessible, available photographs on either iNaturalist or one of the state herbarium portals like PlantNet or FloraBase or VicFlora, or a few other websites that we also surveyed. And so that is over 15% of Australia's entire flora, which was pretty amazing to me, right? Like, we have had, yes, of course, digital cameras haven't been around for as long as herbarium specimens have, but we've had a pretty good couple of decades of people photographing plants all around Australia every single day. And to still have that many unphotographed was a bit of a surprise to me. So I set out to rectify this. So over the last few years, I've really been working to both find these plants myself and also promote other people to take photographs of these plants and upload them to iNaturalist. Before I dig into that, this is one of the main figures from that first paper, showing exactly where in Australia plant species were and weren't photographed well. No real surprises here. You could probably have guessed what this map would look like beforehand, that smaller states and territories like Tasmania, ACT and Victoria, that have not only a smaller land area, but also far fewer species, they tended to be the most complete, whereas our biggest states with the most plant diversity were the ones that had the fewest plant species photographed. And so, of course, Western Australia, with more than half of our entire country's native flora, was the most incomplete from a photographic perspective. And if we look at a slightly different version of that map, so this is a hotspot map, or in fact, a cold spot map, if you want to think about it that way, that I created. So what this map basically is it looked at every single herbarium specimen of all of those unphotographed plants. And what it did was it plotted where those plants occur. So the warmer colors, the yellows, means that those areas have more unphotographed species. And there are really three main areas to look out for. So one of them is southwestern Western Australia, so particularly around the Stirling Range and Fitzgerald River National Park. One of them is up in the Wet Tropics World Heritage Area around the Daintree Rainforest. But absolutely the number one hotspot in the whole country for unphotographed plants is actually Kakadu National Park in the top end of the Northern Territory, and then directly below it, Nipmillick National Park. And in fact, out of the top 5 1 degree by 1 degree grid cells across all of Australia for unphotographed plants, 2 of them were actually in Kakadu National Park. So if you want to try and tick some of those plants off, I highly recommend going to Kakadu National Park. Now, a couple of years after I wrote that paper, I wrote a second paper looking at how those species had actually been ticked off. And there were a couple of really important lessons. So one of them was that 99% of the species that were ticked off in the few years afterwards, they were all uploaded to iNaturalist. A very, very tiny percentage were uploaded to things like VicFlora or PlantNet by professional botanists. but the overwhelming majority were put up onto iNaturalist. Another key lesson here was that experts are really important, of course, because in many cases, people had photographed plants that had never been photographed before, and they had uploaded them to iNaturalist sometimes years ago, but they had never been identified as species because they were waiting for the right person to look at them. So the fact that over the last few years in particular, the number of botanical experts who have been joining iNaturalist and sharing their knowledge has really, really skyrocketed. That has brought up this massive rise in the amount of species that are now being identified and realizing, actually, hey, these photographs uploaded 3 years ago, those are actually the first ever photographs of this plant species. So as one interesting, or a couple of interesting examples of this, when I did my Kakadu trip that I mentioned, knowing that Kakadu and Nitmillik were some of the biggest hotspots for unphotographed plant species in Australia, I thought I would go and find some of these myself. And I had already planned to go down to a little town called Pine Creek to try and photograph hooded parrots, which I was very glad I did find. That's the bird you can see on the screen there. And on the road past Pine Creek, when I was looking at maps of specimens, there are actually 2 plant species that were unphotographed and were right along the side of the road. So I thought, let's go and get those. So the first of them was a crinum. So many of you might be familiar with Crinum pedunculatum, the swamp lily. It occurs all along the east coast of Australia, often in coastal environments. Northern Territory has a number of quite rare and range-restricted crinum species. One of these being Crinum muelleri. So this is only a very recently described species in the last 10 to 15 years. And there was a record that was collected in 2018, a physical specimen held at the Northern Territory Herbarium. And it was listed as being 90 kilometers south of Pine Creek along the road. There were some pretty good notes. And so hopped in the car. We drove down 90 kilometers south of Pine Creek, pulled over at the side of the road on the highway, got a lot of weird looks from the cars going past us, tromped through this big swamp underwater, and at almost the exact spot that this species had been collected 7 years ago, I found a single individual flowering plant. So this is the first ever photograph published online, at least, the first ever online photograph of Crinum muelleri, this really, really rare restricted crinum species in the top end of the Northern Territory. And then about 5 minutes after that, I managed to get a second one, and there was an acacia species, Acacia maloclada, that again, it was just, we pulled off to a truck stop along the side of the road and walked a few hundred meters down the path, and there was a whole bunch of individuals of this acacia, which again, have no published images online before my photographs. And in the bottom right corner, we even have the first photographs of someone taking a photograph of Acacia maloclada. So for anyone who is interested, you can scan this QR code, and this will take you to a live dynamic spreadsheet that I maintain online. So you can see there on the right-hand side, things started off at about 3,715 species. That was in April 2022. And in the 3 or so years since, we have ticked off more than 1,200 of them. Now, yes, that's a lot, but that still leaves more than 2,500 species that need photographs of live plants in the field to be uploaded online. So if you scan that QR code, that will take you to a Google Sheets document online that I actively maintain every week. And the second tab of that spreadsheet is a list of every single species that still needs to be photographed. And for each species, it tells you exactly which states and territories it occurs in. Be very, very grateful if you could check out that spreadsheet and either go out there and try and photograph these species, or if you know that you already do have photographs of them, uploading them to iNaturalist would be fantastic. And the last one I wanted to talk about here before I wrap up is actually species discovery. Because not only if you take photos of plants and upload them to iNaturalist, not only are you contributing really important information on existing species distributions, on invasive species, on threatened species, uploading photos of things that have never been photographed before, there are now an increasing number of cases where citizen scientists are actually discovering brand new plant species that have actually never been recorded by botanists before. So this is another paper that I just recently published, and that's also being included in my PhD. And if we look here at this map, we were able to find at least 12 examples of plants that had been uploaded to iNaturalist in the last 3 or 4 years that were brand new species that had never been described before. And directly because of these records, botanists were able to then go out, collaborate with those observers, find those populations again, collect physical specimens, and then describe those plants. Now, you'll notice that a lot of these are, unsurprisingly, in Mexico and the Americas on the left-hand side of the map. But what you may have noticed is that one of these actually came from Australia. So this here was Cecia Walloubii. Again, we have Aidan Webb appearing, as well as Bertrand Barrett. And the really key thing here to look at, and why this was a case that was perfectly suited for iNaturalist, is this explanation from the paper, which was that species in the genus Cecia in Eastern Australia are very easily missed in the understory unless they're flowering, because the leaves are pretty small and innocuous, and that really important characters for identifying this particular genus of plants, like the flowers, they either aren't collected at all, or they lose particular details like color, which I mentioned before, once they have been vouchered. And so here, this is where photographs of live plants play a really important role. So we had here a whole bunch of photos that were uploaded not just by Tony Eales, but also a couple of others, Ted Johansson and Scott Gavins. And they had uploaded multiple observations in southeast Queensland of this Cecia. And Aidan Webb, Russell Barrett, who are both active users of iNaturalist, they were browsing all of these photos, and they suddenly realized that there was something special here, and that this was something that almost certainly represented a brand new species. So they got in contact with some of those naturalists who had uploaded those photographs, and they organized for them to collect some specimens. And then they extensively searched through existing specimens that were in the Brisbane and New South Wales herbaria. And it turns out this species had actually been collected way back in the 1950s and the 1960s, but because the specimens had lost their color, their floral color straight away, all of the specimens had been misidentified as a much more common Cecia species that's present along the whole East Coast. So the flowers here, the photographs of the flowers uploaded to iNaturalist were that missing puzzle piece that were really crucial to recognizing, hey, this is actually a brand new species that we didn't realize before, that had been overlooked. And so they were able to collect specimens and describe it as something brand new, which is pretty exciting. Now, just to round things out, we've gone through all of the ways that you can contribute to iNaturalist, but one of the most common questions and queries I always get when I give these kinds of workshops and talks is, what do I actually need to photograph, and what should I take images of? Because of course you have tens of thousands of plant species across Australia. All of them are different, and often all of them are identified with different features. So it can be really tricky figuring out what to take photos of. And particularly this is the case because when new people, or I should say when fresh botanists and citizen scientists first start taking an interest in plants and uploading photographs, there are some really common hurdles they stumble over. So one of them is taking just one photograph of a tree from very far away. So there are an alarming number of eucalypt photos taking just one photo of the tree from 20 or 30 meters away. And in those cases, it can be pretty difficult to identify things. Or a very common thing to see in very fresh-faced botanists or botanical enthusiasts, I should say, is taking a top-down, very close-up photo of a flower with no other features. Now, both of those types of photos, they are useful, but not just in isolation. So here, you can pretty much take 7 or 8 photos of any plant you encounter to really maximize your chances of it getting identified and maximize the value of that data. Now, of course, this is going to differ from genus to genus, from family to family, and many groups of plants have really specific and very esoteric features that you need to photograph, like hairs on stems or arrangements of bracts on the underside of flowers. But as a nice general rule, if you try and get this set of photos or as close to it for most of the plants that you encounter and you don't recognize, you should be able to get an ID or pretty close to one. And then once you build up that knowledge, you're able to learn the more obscure features for some of those other groups. So the first of these is a photograph of the whole plant in the context of its environment. This is one of the most important shots you can take, but it's one of the photos that most people miss out on. So they often don't think to take a photo of the whole plant. Why is this important? Well, straight away it shows you a rough approximation of size. It tells you the habit of the plant. So is it a shrub, a herb, a tree? Is it procumbent? Is it prostrate? Is it erect? Are the branches weeping? Are they held upright? It shows you the soil type and the surrounding habitat, and it shows you other species that might be growing nearby. So this is a really, really useful photo that I highly recommend always taking with any plant. It's really important to take photographs of leaves. And again, these are kind of one of the most underrated and yet one of the most important features for identification. And it's particularly important to take photographs of both the top side of the leaves and the underside of the leaves. Now, in some cases, like this particular species, the underside and the top side are basically identical. But for many, many plant species, the top and the bottom side of the leaves may be different colors. One side may have hairs and the other side might be glabrous. One side might have a different patterning of veins to the others. One side might have thorns or spines while the other doesn't. So always get photos of both sides of the leaves. It is, of course, always good to get flowers if they are present. And it's really useful in particular to get a photo from directly above, but also from underneath the flower so that you can see things like sepals. And again, this is a photo that a lot of people don't necessarily think to take of because it isn't really an intuitive angle, but underneath the flower can often be as important or even more important than above the flower, particularly for certain groups like Asteraceae. Then you want to get, of course, as well the fruit if they're present. And for this particular case, because it's a bit of a strange looking fruit, I've taken 2 different photos from 2 different angles to show the shape well. Then we want to get a close-up of the bark or a branchlet. So if you're dealing with a tree or a shrub, you can take a photograph of both the main trunk or the stem to get the bark there, and then also the bark on a smaller branchlet because those can be different. If you're just dealing with a small kind of herb or shrub, you can just look at a branchlet, and this can tell you about what kind of bark is there, but also things like glands or hairs, which are often very important. Then we also want to get a photo of a whole branchlet. Now, of course, this is going to show you features that you have already photographed individually, but it is just useful for putting those features into context, because here I can look at how big these features are in relation to each other. I can see their position, are the leaves alternate or opposite, and so it's just a useful additional photo to take. And so combining those photos here, I've got in this case 8 photographs of this plant, and all of them put together are able to tell me that this plant is a species called Tribulus suberosus. So this is one I photographed up near Shark Bay in Western Australia. And it was through all of these photographs that I was able to identify it. So if you can always aim to just try and get a nice photographic set of somewhere between generally, say, 5 to 8 photographs, if you've got no idea what a plant is, chances are that'll be enough to identify it. So I'll round things out there by saying, yeah, I really appreciate everyone tuning in, and I look forward to answering some questions. And the number one most important thing you can do is to be curious, to get outdoors, and to photograph and record as many plants as you possibly can, because you never know when you might stumble over something really amazing. Thank you.
Wow, Tom. Brad and I are just looking at each other and going, oh, we've got to upload all our photos. Oh, we didn't take photos of all the bits and pieces we should have. Look, that was really inspiring. There's a few people online that might be able to help you out with that Kakadu and Nitmalak photos. Corey Driscoll, I saw you're online. Time for a few trips. The other thing that we can do is just remind everyone in our network, and particularly people that work in some of those hotspots, wet tropics, Kimberley, across the north and down in Western Australia, to be uploading their photos, because I think particularly that southwestern WA one, they may exist in someone's file records. So now I think you answered a lot of those questions with your what to photograph. Let me have a look, Brad. What have we got here in the chat? Do you have any? Oh yeah, that's a good one, Sam, as well. We're out and we spot we don't know what to do. I think Jim and Isabella, I think Tom just answered your questions about what you photograph. Sam Good has raised a really interesting one because it applies for me too, because I use Canberra Nature Mapper. He's asked Tom, do you have any views on comparable platforms such as Nature Mapper, which is available nationwide but most active, and I know in our region and down the south coast of New South Wales? What is that sort of potential interface between all of these platforms, and we'll be able to compare data as well down the track?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So, well, the first thing is that all of these platforms are going to be feeding into the Atlas of Living Australia.
Yep.
And so the important thing, of course, is to be uploading it somewhere and having your data available and publicly usable by researchers and conservationists. So whichever platform you do end up preferring and using, it's much better than using no platform at all. So that's the first important thing, is to get your records up there. Personally, I think iNaturalist is the better platform for this kind of thing, especially, look, if you're in Canberra and the ACT, then NatureMap is a good choice because there are a lot of local experts who are very knowledgeable about Canberra and ACT species, both for plants, but other taxa as well, because NatureMapper is like iNaturalist in that you can upload any taxon versus things like, say, eBird or Frog ID, which have a very specific focus. But from most of the kind of data use and UI and the usability in the data, iNaturalist is kind of top of the pops. Nothing beats it, not just in Australia, but in the world. So one of the really key advantages as well with iNaturalist that it holds over NatureMapper and other platforms is the huge amount of experts that are using the platform, like hundreds, literally thousands of, and again, if we want to just focus on the plants, botanists and taxonomists and curators from around the whole country, that platforms like NatureMapper just haven't built up that expert network yet. It's difficult because it's a positive feedback loop, right? So as more experts join iNaturalist, it makes it more likely that more experts will join in the future. And so you end up getting a platform that kind of really dominates the others. And so I would say that both now and going into the future, personally, I would generally recommend iNaturalist in almost all cases, apart from, again, if you're in ACT or Canberra, because there is that local knowledge base built up. It's definitely a viable option there. But the fact that there are so many users, so many records, so many species, and so many people using those records, if you really want to maximize where your data is being used, I would absolutely recommend iNaturalist. So I think to highlight that is, so I've recently written a paper with some colleagues from the United States that will be published soon, and we looked at every single scientific paper from the last decade that used iNaturalist data. And it is somewhere in the order, I can't remember the exact number, but somewhere in the order of 7,000 to 8,000 scientific papers. And so that doesn't even count all the management documents and conservation projects that actively used iNaturalist data. And then if you compare that to something like NatureMapper in scientific papers is single digits. So the kind of reality is that almost all of the experts and data users and researchers and land managers, they're looking to iNaturalist to use the data. And so that's kind of where the most eyes are on it. So I guess short answer to that is NatureMapper is great for ACT and Canberra, but iNaturalist has a much better, I would say, infrastructure and much more support in terms of changes being made to the platform and the money being pumped in from donors and partners, and just the sheer scale and magnitude of the records present and the contributors that are active on iNaturalist make it far more powerful, at least in the current day.
And that's an amazing impact when you're talking about all that scientific research and those papers that are being published. Now, I assume because the iNaturalist data all feeds into ALA, people are concerned about sensitive data for threatened species and rare species, Tom. So how is that managed in terms of obfuscation? Presumably you use the same sort of lists that are used?
Absolutely. So that's a great question. So I worked at Atlas of Living Australia over the last few years, and this was one of my main jobs, interfacing with iNaturalist. So each of the state and territory departments have their own sensitive species list, which range from Tasmania only having 4 sensitive species on their entire list, not just plants, but everything, all the way up to Western Australia, which has thousands and thousands of location-sensitive species, and then everyone else somewhere in between. But each of the states and territories provide their list to the Atlas of Living Australia. And then one of my main jobs was implementing all of those on iNaturalist. And basically what happens in iNaturalist is that if a species has been deemed to have sensitive locations, every record of it that gets uploaded will be automatically obscured. And what happens with the obscuration is that you will put in the true coordinates where you saw that thing. And then from a public view, they will get randomly scrambled into a roughly 500 square kilometer box. So it's about 0.2 by 0.2 degrees of latitude and longitude. So if you're just a public member and you're looking at that record, all you can see is a randomly generated point in a 500 square kilometer box, and you know it's somewhere inside that box. And then also the date and time get stripped, and so you can only see the month and the year. And then there are a few other small tweaks that get added as well. And so not only can that be done on a whole species basis automatically, but let's say you have an orchid which hasn't been formally listed as threatened and isn't listed as a sensitive species. You can also manually obscure your records on an individual case-by-case basis.
Okay.
So maybe you found an orchid and your state government hadn't listed it as sensitive yet, but you were worried about that population getting poached or trampled on. You can still upload those records, but you can obscure them on an individual basis. And then if a researcher or a manager comes along and they're interested in those records, there are multiple different avenues for being able to share the true coordinates of your records with those legitimate researchers.
Yeah, because I wonder if that sometimes puts off some of our kind of botanists and scientists because they're actually worried about that aspect as well once they've uploaded a photo. Look, we're getting close to time. We are on time. Look, I think there'll be a lot of people interested, Thomas, in perhaps doing that, more interactive workshop around, although you've given us a pretty good spread of the, what we need to photograph, the features, the plant phenology stuff. Like, had no idea that sort of information was that secondary information was being stored. I'm really interested to hear about the outcome of your PhD too, so I might get you to share your papers. I think there'll be a lot of interest in your papers. We can certainly do a post following this webinar to encourage people to start photographing plants and find, let them know where they can find that QR code. We can share that QR code and also have some conversations in their own networks about some of these gaps. So I think we'll sign off. Thank you so much. Although, Brad, there's one final question I'd like, which Brad has put up, which is, what's your personal favourite group that you photograph and then identify? Although it looks like you've got many favourites, Tom.
Yes, no, that's a great question. I would have to say I am increasingly getting interested in eucalypts. And if I had said that, if someone had heard me say that a few years ago, they'd have thought I was crazy. I hated eucalypts. Having grown up in Sydney my whole life and East Coast, I found them a very difficult group because, of course, a lot of the time the material is 40 or 50 meters in the canopy, and you can't see the flowers and the fruits and the buds, and the diversity isn't that high along the Eastern Australian coast. And so I thought eucalypts were pretty rubbish, and I was never that interested. And then a few years ago, I started to do my trips to Western Australia, and it completely changed my mind. Western Australia's incredible eucalypt diversity, and 99% of the species are mallees, and so they're all 2, 3, 4 meters tall, and you can photograph everything.
And they're spectacular when they're in flower.
Yes, absolutely. Some of the flowers and the fruits and the opercula on some of the amazing eucalypts in WA are just absolutely amazing. So they are a group that I have gotten a lot more interested in over the last few years.
Thanks so much, Tom. That's really inspired me to get and start. I mean, I am an iNaturalist user. I noticed there's a new app too, an updated app, upgraded app has just been issued, and I've been getting, once you join everyone, you get little messages from the administrator telling you about features and all sorts of other things. So join the network. And so everyone knows there will be a web link, so you'll be able to share this with your colleagues because not everyone could make it today. And I'll grab all of those papers of Tom's around his research, and hopefully your PhD is almost finished.
A few months away, so I'm close.
Oh, that nasty write-up stage. So thanks again, Tom, for your time and generously sharing.
No worries, it was my pleasure.
Knowledge about iNaturalist. Thanks everyone for attending.